The revolution is real, it's live, and as some comrades say, it's lit, right? Lit. The revolution is lit.
Uhuru comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Akilia Anai, Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. Today's study will be on the African revolutionary Malcolm X and African Martyrs Day, and to quote the African Socialist International Secretary General Loezi Kinshasa, on February 21, 1965, the U.S. government, under the regime of Democrat President Lyndon B. Johnson, assassinated Malcolm X with the clear intent to silence the growing Black liberation movement within the United States. It failed, as testified by the rise of the Black Power movement that followed Malcolm X's death. The institutionalization of February 21st as African Martyrs Day by the African People's Socialist Party validates the saying, "You can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution," quoted by Fred Hampton, the former chair of the Black Panther Party Chicago, who was also assassinated by the U.S. government as a result of the assault on the Black Revolution of the 60s. This day is dedicated to be known to the known, lesser known, and unknown African martyrs in the history of the longest national liberation struggle in the world. Malcolm X was known for his fearless anti-colonial leadership in the face of U.S. colonial power, the most barbaric colonial power that has ever existed on this planet. He taught us to confiscate the weapon of fear from our oppressors to prevent them from using it against us. To expound on this further, we will be reviewing the following educational pieces located in the YouTube/Facebook descriptions: African Martyrs Day Resolution, passed at the First Congress of the African People's Socialist Party in September 1981. On International African Martyrs Day, this system must die, from the February 21st, 1982 African Martyrs Day event in Seattle, Washington, published in Not One Step Backward, the Black Liberation Movement from 1971 to 1982 by Omali Yeshitela, and Live Like Our African Martyrs, Death in the Struggle is Better Than Life on Our Knees by Omali Yeshitela, published as The Point of the Spear in the 2004 February edition of the Burning Spear newspaper and in the book Omali Yeshitela Speaks. It is my honor now to introduce leader and founder of the African People's Socialist Party, the man who picked up the torch to ensure the lives of our African martyrs were not taken in vain, Chairman Omali Yeshitela.
Uhuru. We want to talk about Malcolm X and martyrdom, because it is true that our oppressors really only have a few tools at their command in order to control and dominate African people and the oppressed peoples of the world. terror, prison, death. And death, of course, is the ultimate tool. It is the thing that is used so often to not only stop people who are engaged in struggle, but to terrorize people who might otherwise become engaged in struggle to free our people. And many people do not engage in struggle, trying to win our freedom, because we have been convinced that to do so could mean the loss of our lives, or the loss of the lives of people who are dear to us. And it is this horrible weapon that has prevented so many people from joining the ranks of the army of the oppressed. We want to talk about martyrdom today, African Martyrs Day and Malcolm X. Throughout this country and the world, people will be talking about Malcolm X. It was on February 21st, 54 years ago, that the US government, along with enemies of our people who are among us, killed Malcolm X, murdered Malcolm X. And Malcolm had come to symbolize the highest recognition of the oppression, exploitation of African people, and the solidarity of the oppressed peoples around the world. Malcolm represented an era that was rapidly changing, where the oppressed people were moving beyond this process of simply protesting the system and or the oppression and exploitation within the system. And Malcolm X was raising the question of revolution and the fact that African people had to go beyond trying to perfect imperialism, but to rid ourselves of this relationship with empire. And it was at a time where the civil rights movement was losing steam, and Malcolm X had broken from the restraints of the Nation of Islam, which had played an incredibly important role in terms of raising up the question of nationhood, nationality in its own way, and making a major assault on the assumptions of the significance of whiteness, of the deification of the white man. In fact, had taken whiteness and white deification and flipped it over and characterized it, the white man, the colonial power, as the devil. So the nation played a major role, an important role. But one of the things that characterized the Nation of Islam that Malcolm had begun to run into on a regular basis was that the Nation of Islam would not engage in the struggles on the ground that African people were involved in. And this was a criticism that Malcolm was confronting with African people who say that you talk a good game, you sound very good, but you're not doing anything on the ground. Malcolm had left the Nation of Islam. That was a critically important organization at the time. Malcolm had criticized in the most serious, fierce way the limitations of the civil rights movement, that, as he characterized it, was about trying to integrate into a burning house. In other words, Malcolm had recognized the crisis of imperialism and saw that white power was on its last leg, and he criticized those who would try to integrate into this burning house. He raised the question of revolution in this country and around the world. He talked about the difference in what was characterized as the Black Revolution by so many people who wanted to talk about revolution but didn't want to do anything, and who, as he characterized it, would actually be afraid of revolution. And he mentioned the fact that when you talked about revolution, revolution had objectives, and it had various tactics and strategies that had to be adhered to. Malcolm X was a serious threat and to imperialism, and a serious leader of African people and other oppressed peoples around the world at a time when the masses of people around the world were fighting furiously against the domination of white power, imperialism, colonialism, and imperialism in any of its various forms. So Malcolm X was important to us. And as I said, that there will be people, or have been people throughout this country and throughout the world who will be extolling the virtues of Malcolm X. They will take Malcolm X and they will take him off the pedestal for a day or two and celebrate him, and then in most instances put him back on the pedestal until the next year, this time. But we think it's important for us to understand Malcolm X and his significance, and also this whole question of martyrdom, something that we attempted to introduce to our movement with our first Congress held in 1981. Malcolm X was influential at a critical time in the history of the world, not just for African people in the United States, but worldwide. Malcolm was killed in February of 21st, 1964. He had, before that, February 1965, before that, we had seen 3 years earlier the US government, the French and the Belgians work with other imperialist powers and track down to murder Patrice Lumumba, who they literally butchered. And burned and put his remains in acid to try to remove any evidence that he ever existed before. This was a period where in 1967, 2 short years after the assassination, the murder of Malcolm X, Che Guevara had been wounded and captured in Bolivia and then murdered. And interestingly, all efforts were made to bury him, to disappear his body, so that there would be nothing left for the people to be able to hold up and recognize as a heroic effort to overturn this horrible relationship that has existed in the world at least since the advent of the Portuguese attack on Africa 600 years ago, and the enslavement, the colonial enslavement of black people, the dispersal of African people throughout the world. So they wanted this to go away. Malcolm was assassinated again in 1964 at a time where there had been incredible developments in our struggle. 1966 saw the overthrow by the US government of Kwame Nkrumah, who was working all over the African continent and throughout much of the African world, in fact, throughout the world, struggling not only against imperialism in general, but working to unite Africa and African people, to fight for a united Africa. And he was overthrown in 1966. He would be later murdered, that is to say, death by mysterious illness. So this was a really important moment in history. The Vietnamese were waging incredible struggle against white power imperialism, and in many ways, the Vietnamese carried our struggles almost alone on their shoulders. This is one of the things that inspired Che Guevara, even before his death, to declare that we needed 2-3 mini Vietnams, because Che was unable to understand the significance of the Vietnamese Revolution and what it meant in terms of imperialism being able to hold on, what it meant in terms of deepening the crisis of imperialism, even as there were forces, certainly in the United States, who were leftists and call themselves communists and call themselves socialists, who were talking about bring the boys home and no more Vietnams. Che understood that the struggle in Vietnam, the heroic battle, the heroic struggle of the peasants and working class in Vietnam under a revolutionary communist party deepened the crisis of imperialism and meant that we can begin to measure the length of time that imperialism would have on the face of the earth. And Malcolm X was one of the forces at a critical time that in many ways brought all of these issues together. Malcolm did know and meet Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, and Malcolm was someone who was outspoken around what was happening to our people in Congo and how the white power imperialist countries created this image of somehow the black people in Congo killing white missionaries and nuns or something to that effect would justify going into Congo. And the United Nations and all of the imperial powers collaborated to make sure that Congo could not be successfully liberated, and also that Patrice Lumumba would pay a horrible death for even trying. Now we are in the year 2019, a time in the 21st century where, while there has been any amount of protest since the 2014, August 9, 2014 rebellion on Canfield Drive in St. Louis, Ferguson, Missouri, that was led by the African working class, it is a struggle that has been muzzled. It is a struggle that has been obscured and turned into some effort to make imperialism better. Cries like Black Lives Matter, as if it does, if they really do, to imperialism. Cries, hands up, don't shoot. And then an era where social media militancy has become a substitute for a genuine revolutionary activity. So the question of martyrdom to many today may seem unusual and extraordinary, but it is a really important question, because African people are going to have to fight our way out of this situation, and African people are still colonized, even if we have instances we have this situation of horrible petty bourgeois leaders, the ones who were left standing after everybody else was killed, after the revolution was destroyed, the ones who were able to define for an upcoming generation what struggle should be about. It wasn't Malcolm, it wasn't Patrice Lumumba, it wasn't the Black Panther Party of old that was now defining this reality. It was a sector that was able to rise up as a substitute for revolution, as what Malcolm X would characterize as a pacification, that just like you give a baby a pacifier, a baby's hungry and wants his mother's milk, and you stick a pacifier in his mouth so that the baby thinks, at least momentarily, that he is being fed, and of course it's not being fed. And certain pacification has happened with African people, militant petty bourgeois forces, people who are able to block interstates, and people who militantly demand to be allowed to have equality within a social system that is bent on destroying most of humanity. That has become the substitute. People have been removed in many instances from relationships with each other. And instead of organizing and discussing and struggling around critical questions among ourselves, find ourselves hiding behind computer screens and liking this or liking that. And depending on how many likes one can get, then one is or is not a revolutionary. Depending on how many views one can get on social media, one is or is not significant to the struggle of African people. This has become a substitute for real struggle. So I can see how some people can assume that this issue of martyrdom is not something that is significant, but it is significant. because we are going to have to fight our way out of this. Because, when the computers shut off, or whether they shut off or not, the fact is that those computers are only successful because of the success of imperialism and stripping the resources of African people in Congo and other places like that. We're going to take those resources back from Microsoft, and we're going to take those resources back from Apple in Congo and other places. The computers are going to go down, and whether they do or not, of course, it's going to be necessary to fight. Cyberspace is not going to be the primary arena of struggle for our liberation. That's going to happen on the ground. As Malcolm X said before, the white man cannot win another ground war because there are many more of us than there are of him. So in the final analysis, we're going to have to fight block by block, house to house, throughout the United States and throughout much of the world. And there are going to be many, 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 many martyrs. And we talk about martyrs. It is a word that really translates into something like a witness, as someone, a believer, as someone who has been willing to die in religious terms, or to witness for a particular religion and to die for that religion before renouncing it, and something to that effect. The Arabic Muslim characterization or term for that is shaheed. We know people who are called shaheed, and they are shaheed because it means a witness, and it means also, it has also come to mean a martyr, someone who's willing to suffer martyrdom. So usually when we talk about martyrdom and martyrs, we talk about people who have accepted a certain belief and are willing to die for that, and a person who has died for a certain belief. And we think it's important to have this discussion because the fact is that after death, there's nothing that the imperialist powers have that they can use to terrify us. In fact, one of the reasons the imperialists use such brutality in killing us is to set an example for those who are living, that this is what can happen to you should you ever resist. This is why Mike Brown was left for 4.5 hours on August on Canfield Drive in St. Louis to rot away in the sweltering heat, because it was to be an example to every African in St. Louis, every African in Ferguson, every African in that oppressed, colonized community. This is why Malcolm X was assassinated the way he was, in broad daylight, where he would be an example. And then you had Fred Hampton. You had all of the people who are our leaders who were killed in such grotesque ways, and they were killed not only to remove them, but also to terrorize those who were alive. But if terror was something that would prevent us from struggling, then Malcolm X never would have struggled, and Martin Luther King never would have struggled. Anybody who watched the video of the presentation of Martin Luther King on the night before he was murdered in Memphis can see, just from that presentation, that King knew that he was marked to die. And of course, he had been warned over and over again by the FBI. And Malcolm X spoke himself, and on December 3rd, I think it was, at Oxford University in 1964. And I have read that after his debate at Oxford University, at the Oxford Union, he was asked what he saw for the future. And he made the comment that he would be dead, that he is going to be killed, that he knew that they were out to kill him, and he said it. And if a willingness to, if the ability to stop the struggle could occur, to keep Malcolm X, to stop Malcolm X, was a threat of death, then he never could have done it. And if the fear and threat of death could keep us from struggling, keep us from leading forward, then our people will not struggle. And that's why we have to take from the oppressor this fear of death and really hold up the whole issue of martyrdom. I was in Nicaragua shortly after the Nicaraguan Revolution. And one of the things that I was struck by traveling throughout communities in Nicaragua. There were homes, yards of Nicaraguans where there were crosses in the yard, and these crosses represented the people in the family who had died through repression, through the Somoza regime that had been put and kept in power by the U.S. government, and that had died as a consequence of U.S. interference in their lives, the provisions of the guns, the bombs, the terror, the training that killed them. And they were there to remind the people of the martyrdom, of the heroic sacrifices that the people have made. And they were not there to frighten the people in Nicaragua not to struggle. But they were there as evidence of the courage of the community and the willingness to go against fear, because fear is normal. It is something that all human beings, or most human beings, are capable of experiencing. The thing, however, that distinguishes us is that we are not immobilized by fear. Fear should not immobilize us. At the moment, fear prevents us from doing what we need to do in order to win our freedom, or to win the freedom of the masses, or to win the freedom of the working class, to win the liberation of our nation. At the moment, fear prevents us from doing that. It's no longer something that's called fear, it's called cowardice. And so what we have done is take this issue of martyrdom, the African martyr, and raise it high, to take the fear of death away from us, to take this possibility that we might die at the hands of the imperialists away from the arsenal of the oppressor, so that they no longer have this as a tool and weapon that they can use against us. To say that it is better to struggle. It is better to struggle. It is better to fight back. There is no dignity in crawling on your knees in your belly, surrendering to imperialism, surrendering your future, surrendering the future of our people. One. And of course, the other thing about martyrdom is that it recognizes that there is an oppressor at play here, that it is not just a bad guy who didn't act right. I was talking to someone just on last night, and they said they remember something that they had voted for William Jefferson Clinton, you know, the white guy who they called him Slick Willie people who knew him in Arkansas, but who had somehow come to be known through the African petty bourgeoisie as the first black president. He played the saxophone. He is a horrible human being. He's done all kinds of grotesque things. And she was saying to me that she had voted for Clinton, and she remembered talking to me about, or in a meeting, and people were trying to extol the virtues of Clinton. And then she remembered what I was saying, said she didn't know all of the horrible things that Clinton had done. And she was so sorry that she voted for Clinton. But there's a great likelihood that she went and voted for Obama. But the point is not just some bad individuals. And this is what our understanding of martyrdom. Martyrdom recognizes that there's a system of oppression that dominates the whole people. We are martyrs because of our opposition to, our struggle against, because we have died as a consequence of what this system, a colonial system, a system of colonial capitalism has done to us. And so that's really important to understand too, because that's one of the ways that we can recognize martyrdom from a people. And so at the first Congress of the African People's Socialist Party, we're going to be looking at the three documents that Comrade Director of Agitprop, Akili, and I just mentioned a moment ago in introducing this study. And the first of them is something from our first Congress, the first Congress of the African People's Socialist Party that was held in Oakland, California in September of 1981. And this was the first Congress, but the Congress was held 9 years after the founding of the party. And it was held 9 years after the founding of the party because the party was founded at the very time where the U.S. government was engaged in a serious mop-up of the African Revolution, the Black Revolution of the 1960s. People were being killed everywhere, and we were still experiencing that terror and the aggression of the United States government. And it was impossible in most cases to actually announce that we have a Congress to build a revolutionary party, to publicly say that, to put it out. because even meetings in our communities where we were organizing free food programs or free breakfast programs, and where we were just trying to get organized to sell our newspapers and things like that, these processes, programs, institutions were under attack. I mean, you were subject to see the police, FBI raiding our meetings and things like that to make sure that we didn't proceed. So the idea of having a Congress was something that a publicly announced Congress was difficult for us to be able to deal with at the time. And then, of course, there was our inexperience as a revolutionary movement. I mean, the African Revolution had very little experience in doing something like holding Congresses. The African Revolution rooted in the African working class. I mean, we had very little experience. So it was only in 1981 that we were able to have our first Congress, and this happened in Oakland, California in September. And I want to just read from the resolution that we passed at that Congress. It was a very important Congress, probably the most important event that the African People's Socialist Party had initiated since our founding, because this was the first instance where the party membership at large was able to come in and struggle over things like the program of the party, to collectively engage in electing the leaders of the party, to be able to come together collectively to pass resolutions that were define the party, where we were going, and things like that, which in many ways the 1981 Congress is the thing that gave a greater and enhanced legitimacy to the African People's Socialist Party. It was a time where we had moved temporarily away from the wartime organization of an activity of the party to be able to have enough space to do the Congress. So I'm going to read from this, and hopefully we'll be able to read all three of these, but you have possession of them, and I did this overview to try and give some kind of background and establish the political basis for what it is that we were doing, and to a lesser extent even the ideological basis for what it is that we were doing. I think it's really important for us to understand that the African People's Socialist Party survived the attack on the revolution. Not only did we survive the attack, but we've been moving to provide solutions to the defeat of the African Revolution of the 1960s. And of course, the martyrs that we are talking about were a part of the attack and defeat of the African Revolution. February 21st, Malcolm was killed, but we mentioned also that was in the same time frame that people like King were killed, and people like Fred Hampton were killed, and there were more than a score of members of the Black Panther Party and killed. And prior to this Congress of ours, the founding member of the African People's Socialist Party, Lawrence Mann, was killed. And so, and then there were so many people who were killed and who were imprisoned. We don't know their names. We don't know how many there were. And it gives even greater significance to this whole issue of martyrdom. But what the African People's Socialist Party has done also is that we've extended this definition of martyrs beyond the people who are the believers and the witnesses. We've extended it to include everyone who has fought against colonial domination, whether they called themselves revolutionaries or not. We're talking about people like Lavelle Nixon, who in Oakland, California, a few years ago, caused tremendous amount of consternation because he killed 4 cops in Oakland, California. And it was really telling that despite how he was characterized by the police and by even ruling class media internationally, that African people actually, after Nixon was killed, put up memorabilia and artifacts that extolled his existence, his act. After he was killed, the people in the community came out and showed a tremendous amount of appreciation for him. And this to the consternation of the ruling class and African petty bourgeoisie, that they did this. In St. Petersburg, Florida, there was a man, Hydra Lacey, who was murdered by the police. And the police, they concocted this fanciful story. They have that he had lured the police into his house, and then he had ambushed and killed them. And then, of course, what the police did, the mayor came out while hundreds of African people were outside the house that was surrounded by police and had been shot into and what have you. And the mayor came out and ordered the house bulldozed while Lacey was still there. And then they came and they loaded the remains of the house on trucks and carted it away right away, which is extraordinary, given the fact that one would say that it's a crime scene and you don't destroy a crime scene. But what was learned by some of us later on who paid attention is that Lacey had not ambushed them, that they had captured Lacey. Lacey had actually said, "Okay, you got me." This is according to grand jury testimony. And they were cuffing him, and while they were cuffing him, they were using tasers on him. And this is what set off whatever happened in that house. This is what set it off. And so the cops who died, there were 3 or 4 of them who died. There are plaques up for them in St. Petersburg, Florida today. So Lacey wasn't a revolutionary. He didn't consider himself a revolutionary, and I don't even know how nice he was. But the fact is, in general terms, that he was colonized. And as a colonial subject, he resisted the colonial powers, and he died in the process of resisting the colonial powers. So we've extended the definition. It doesn't have to be somebody who was a quote-unquote believer. It has to be somebody who was being victimized by colonialism, who lived under colonial domination, and whose response to colonial domination resulted in their death. And sometimes even people who did not shoot the oppressor. Sometimes what the white people and their little lackeys in our own community like to refer to as black-on-black crime. We're looking at conditions, circumstances created by colonialism, colonial domination. There is no such thing as normal existence under colonial domination. We are dominated by colonialism, and even sometimes when we pick up a gun and do something, it is a consequence of the stresses and contradictions imposed on our community from some external factor. So most instances, what we call black-on-black crime is really white-on-black crime. It's just an African picking up a gun that colonialism put in his hand, and using it against one of us, because the colonialists never teach us to shoot the colonizer. It always teaches us to shoot each other. It always provides avenues and venues for us to shoot each other, but never at the colonizer. So we've extended this definition of the martyrs, even though we think the most significant evidence of martyrdom can be found in forces like Malcolm X. And this is why we've used February 21st and Malcolm X in particular as the example, an internationally known, internationally respected, internationally recognized leader of the African Revolution that was trying to take us into a whole new era of resistance and struggle, that our oppressors thought that they would stop by killing him, and that in killing him, they wouldn't just stop it by silencing Malcolm X, but they would stop it by creating terror among the people who were like Malcolm X, people who had the potential for becoming Malcolm X, people who had the potential for being influenced by Malcolm X. This, they are telling us, could be you dying in the same grotesque fashion that Malcolm died. So at the first Congress of the African People's Socialist Party held in Oakland, California, in September 1981, a resolution was passed that marked the significance of Malcolm X in the struggle for the liberation of our people. And it reads thusly: the struggle of African people to liberate our national homeland, Africa, to resist oppression and exploitation, to overthrow the system of imperialism and advance the cause of world socialism, has seen hundreds and thousands of our people make the ultimate heroic sacrifice the sacrifice of life itself. I do believe that even that first sentence is really important to understand because it says a lot. Because there are a lot of people who will be talking about Malcolm X this weekend, who talked about Malcolm X on the anniversary of his assassination. But they don't identify this struggle as being connected to this murder, this assassination, this martyrdom. They don't even necessarily connect it as martyrdom. It's something that we bring out, we talk about, we say what a wonderful person he was and how he lived and etc. But we don't talk about it as martyrdom. We don't talk about it as something that he died as a part of a struggle against imperialism and that the colonial capitalist forces are responsible for his death. And they certainly don't talk about it being a part of the struggle of African people to liberate Africa. And they don't talk about it being a part of his martyrdom as a consequence of resisting oppression and exploitation and a part of the struggle to overthrow the system of imperialism and advance the cause of world socialism. This is how we frame the martyrdom of Malcolm X, and I think it's really important for us to understand that. The history of our resistance has been written in blood and flames. It has been punctuated by the courageous examples of such martyrs as Nat Turner, Steve Biko, Patrice Lumumba, Walter Rodney, Nahanda Nyakasinkana, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, Amilcar Cabral, and Lawrence Mann, co-founder of the African People's Socialist Party. Historically, the oppressors of African people have attempted to turn history upside down and present the heroic examples of our freedom fighters as evidence of the futility, the hopelessness of our cause for political independence, African liberation, and world socialism. In many instances, our oppressors have succeeded in demoralizing great numbers of our people by using the examples of brutally murdered African freedom fighters to prove the invincibility of imperialism and the permanence of African oppression and exploitation. The African People's Socialist Party rejects and denounces this reactionary view of the bourgeoisie and calls on all African revolutionaries of all countries to proclaim February 21st, the anniversary of the 1965 imperialist assassination of Malcolm X, as the day of the African martyr. The African People's Socialist Party calls on all African revolutionaries of all countries to take command of the history of our people's struggle for political independence, African liberation, and socialism by taking command of the definition of that history and resistance. The African People's Socialist Party calls on all African revolutionaries of all countries to raise high in a revolutionary manner the heroic memory of all our fallen martyrs, of all those in every city, village, community, and country where they fell as evidence of the determination of our people to fight every battle on every front until liberty has been won. The African People's Socialist Party calls on all African revolutionaries of all countries to initiate special ceremonies and programs in every community where an African revolutionary has fallen, and to raise the memory of our fallen freedom fighters to its appropriate revolutionary and historic significance. The African People's Socialist Party calls on all party members to win the masses within the U.S. and all mass organizations where the African People's Socialist Party has influence to unity with this resolution. We call on every party, unit, region, and organization to take out this call to the masses and to actively work to institutionalize February 21st as the day of the African martyr. We think that's extremely important. We take this fear of death away from the oppressors and are able to extol Malcolm X as a critical force in martyrdom is something that any colonized person should be willing to achieve in the struggle against colonialism and imperialism. That weapon of the fear of death has to be taken from our oppressors. And of course, I know that we're talking now to a lot of people who have no intentions of not only becoming martyrs, but no intentions even of participating in revolutionary struggle as such. I mean, I know we're talking to a lot of people who are simply consumers of information, and it makes you better at debates in barbershops and things like that. But the fact is, we're also talking to revolutionaries, I know, who must be prepared to step up and do everything that is necessary to win the struggle for our liberation. So that is important. Then in 1982, we published a book, and it was just mentioned. It's from a presentation that was made on February 21st, 1982 at African Martyrs Day event in Seattle, Washington, where the party was located at that time. I'm going to try and I'm going to read from this. We'll see how much I'll be able to read, because I'm going to leave enough space here for us to talk about this. First, to talk about Martyrs Day itself. Why is Martyrs Day? Is it significant? Is it something that we are doing? Are we extolling death or something to that effect? And is that significant? And then I think it's important for us to talk about Malcolm X too, to take him out of this place that he has been put, like Marcus Garvey and others who have provided profound leadership for us, but they apparently do not set the kinds of examples for us to follow. And I think many people don't know who they are, except they were poet and they made some speeches that we liked. But Malcolm X was an incredibly significant force in the history of our movement. He truly represented a movement from one era of resistance to another, not only in the United States, but in the world, and has had an incredible effect. And they killed Malcolm, but it was too late, because they killed Malcolm in 1964. And then what you saw happening is in 1966, the demand for black power that was definitely directly connected to Malcolm X, the rise of the Black Panther Party, subsequent to that, the rise of the African People's Socialist Party, JOMO, the African People's, all of these were forces that was influenced by Malcolm X. And of course, we were influenced by Malcolm X, we were influenced by Patrice Lumumba, revolutionaries all. And this is why the bourgeoisie wanted to do everything they can to remove any evidence that many of these forces ever existed, to kill them, destroy their bodies, to wipe them out, and what have you. So I want to go now, we're going to look at on International African Martyrs Day, this system must die. Again, this is a presentation that was made February 21st in 1982, the African Martyrs Day event. This is slightly less than a year after the resolution was passed at our Congress. So Uhuru, when we use the word Uhuru as a greeting, and we also say that we use the word Uhuru as a greeting, and we also say that when we are departing from each other. If you call our office or anywhere in the country where we are living, and I might say in the world where we exist, I'm told that we are known as the Uhurus in South Africa. I know we are known as the Uhurus in what they call the United Kingdom and in France and in Sweden and in Sierra Leone. So if you call our office anywhere in the country or the world where we are living, the phone is answered with the word Uhuru. Uhuru is Swahili. It means freedom. And we do that because we believe that freedom is a thing that ought to be on the minds of black people 24 hours a day. That's why we say freedom. That's why we say it in Swahili. Because when we say freedom, we are talking about black freedom. Some people have a problem when you talk about black freedom. We are the only people in this country and on the face of the earth that when you say black freedom, somehow it automatically means freedom for yourself against somebody else. Somehow, anytime you say black freedom, it means that it cannot be something that stands on its own. It cannot be something of value unto itself. Somehow, when people hear you say black freedom, it automatically means to them that it is anti-something else. And they are right. Because when we say black freedom, and when you hear the words black freedom inside this country, it is certainly the only demand that is capable of overthrowing this country. Black freedom is anti-something. Black freedom is anti-oppression. Black freedom is anti-every institution in this country that destroys human worth. So we say black freedom. We say Uhuru. And we don't apologize to anybody on the face of the earth. If someone has a problem with that, it is because they are identified with the enemy of black people, so there shouldn't be any problem with that. We passed a resolution in our first Congress in September of last year to honor African martyrs. We want to do that not because we enjoy going to funerals. We do that because our enemy likes to show us examples of the great numbers of black people who have died in the struggle attempting to be free and the futility of our struggle. They say, see, you shouldn't be struggling because we killed Malcolm X. You shouldn't fight back because we murdered Patrice Lumumba. You shouldn't fight back because we killed Fred Hampton, Mark Clark in their sleep. They tell you you shouldn't fight back. They want to use the martyrs as an example of the futility of our struggle. We say that the blood of black people has covered the world for several hundred years, and the fact that black people continue to fight in the face of the death that continues to be rained upon us under this system is not evidence of futility, of the futility of the struggle. It is evidence of the fact that black people will never stop fighting until we are free. Until we are free, until we are free. That's what is necessary of, it's evidence of. It is important to talk about that. And it is important to talk about that. And you think about Comrade Louise, I think in his introduction to this discussion, talk about the oldest liberation struggle on the planet Earth. You think about this is a struggle that's been going on now for at least 600 years, if you only account for the transatlantic slave trade that started 600 years ago. It's the oldest revolutionary movement in the world. And you see, they killed us in a very obvious and public way. When this government killed Jack Ruby, who supposedly killed Oswald, who supposedly killed Kennedy. When this government killed Ruby, they killed him by injecting him with cancer. They don't have to kill him the way they killed Dr. Martin Luther King in public view, with a round tearing his throat out. They don't have to kill him like they killed Malcolm X in public view, with a shotgun blast to the chest. They killed them that way in public to let you know that they killed them because they are niggers who got out of place. They do it that way in an attempt to cause demoralization among the masses of our people. Often, every time you look up, you hear black folk who say, every time we get a leader, they kill him. Isn't that what they say? How many times do you hear that? Do you see black people trying to organize right here in Seattle? I know that's what they say. Every time someone stands up, they kill him. We are here today to say that, that too much blood of too many black people for too many generations has been spilled for us to stop fighting now. Too much blood. We want to talk about the martyrs also because it's important for us to hook up with our history. This system, this vicious and vile anti-human system, talking about the American system, this system alienates us from our own history and our own culture. It demands the destruction of our culture. It demands the destruction of our history so that we often don't even know who we are. And to the extent we don't know who we are, we can't fight back. How are you going to fight back? Fight when you think that the government is a legitimate government standing on your shoulders. It's hard to fight under those circumstances. It's only when we are clear who we are, how we got here, and why we got here. To the extent that we are clear, we will never, never, never stop fighting. And that's important. This whole question of a false national consciousness that's been imposed on a people is critical. I mean, imperialist white power, a minority of the human population, has succeeded in becoming powerful and holding on to power because it's like parasitic. It's built a parasitic social system that sucks the blood and resources of peoples all around the world, and especially of African people. And in shaping and creating the world that we live in today, the whole political and economic configuration of the world as we experience it today is something that has been given birth to by slavery and colonialism. You think about how the French, a paltry narcissistic entity in Europe. I mean, think about that. France has lived off first, like Haiti. It sucked the blood, the life of Africans in Haiti through the slave system, through the slave process. It dominates and controls so many territories in Africa that they call countries. This is what keeps it alive. This is what keeps it afloat. And it talks about this wonderful thing that they call French culture. It can't be this can't possibly be anything wonderful about French culture. It's absolutely impossible, because it's a culture that rests upon slavery and colonialism. And there was a time where the French even acknowledged it, where the French would say that the foundation of what they call a French society was Egyptian culture, where they actually went into Egypt and brought out tons and tons. They actually sent scientists, engineers, all kinds of forces into Egypt and captured all kinds of information, knowledge, etc., and then took back tremendous resources, and then they control what is today called something like 14 different countries. And now when the French, in trying to maintain control of what they used to call Indochina, what at one juncture they referred to as Vietnam, the white people in France, this tiny narcissistic entity, they didn't have to fight the Vietnamese by themselves. Here the Vietnamese, they had not only the advantage of the Americans, the support of white imperialist colonial powers of the world. They had participated in creating certain kinds of institutions, such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, such as United Nations, and various other institutions around the world that supported France in this colonial domination of Vietnam. But one of the biggest, most significant weapons in the hands of the French was other colonized peoples, Africans who were colonized in Algeria, Africans in Senegal and other places who went to fight against other colonized people for the French. They went to Vietnam. They're fighting against people who were trying to liberate themselves from French colonialism. These are colonial subjects who did this. 71% of the people who fought for France in Vietnam to keep Vietnamese colonized were colonized subjects themselves. And at least 50 to 65% of the people who fought in American uniforms fought for America when the Vietnamese crushed the French. 50 to 65% of those soldiers were on the front line were African people here. And the only way they could be successful is to confuse us about who the hell we are. They have imposed this false national consciousness on us. And today there are African people roaming all over Africa in the employ of the United States government, killing black people right now as we have this discussion, because they don't understand that we are African people and that America is hostile is the most strategic enemy of everybody on the planet Earth. And this was long before Donald Trump was ever born. This was true. This was true. And so Africans may have participated in creating Vietnamese martyrs who were fighting against U.S. colonialism. Africans may have participated in creating Vietnamese martyrs who were fighting against French colonialism, because we were confused who the hell we were, but the Vietnamese were clear. Despite the fact that the United States had separated them and France had separated them, and there was two so-called Vietnams, a North and a South Vietnam, with the intentions of these people forever being separated, despite the fact that you see them having done the same thing in what they call Korea. There's a North and a South Korea. They split up the peoples and then used the peoples against themselves and against their own interests. And African Martyrs is what stands between us. They're being successful in doing that. That's why it's so important. We say, Africa, Africa. Yes, we are Africans. And we shall fight and kill and die for Africa, as opposed to fighting and killing for imperialism, even when we're shooting at our brothers and sisters. We have to call on all of our people to lay down your arms when it comes to fighting for the imperialist powers. And if you have to become a martyr, the only way you can legitimately become a martyr is become a martyr in the struggle for the liberation of Africa and the African working class. Now, some of us have problems understanding who we are today. We just said something about that. That's why we hear terms like, I'm a Negro American, I'm a second-class citizen, or I'm a Afro-American. You hear a whole bunch of words about who we are, but in the party we always say that if we stepped on the ship in 1619 as Africans, when we got off the ship in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, if that wasn't the ship that Jonah got off and was swallowed by a big whale, if we got on the ship in 1619 as Africans, in Africa as Africans, when we got off the ship in Jamestown, Virginia, we were still Africans. And I know some black people got problems with that because I was here involved in the same struggle as when we didn't want to be black. Remember that one? We were black then, and just as we were black then, we are Africans today in our hearts. You know how bad it is to be a Negro. It felt terrible being a Negro. And then somebody said, yes, my hair is nappy, my nose is wide, my lips are thick, but my skin is black, and I am beautiful. Remember how good you felt when that happened. If you think it felt good becoming a black person, just wait until it becomes clear to you that you are an African. It's important to understand that. Why is it important to understand that? Because you have got to get the basis of the creation of the very existence of this system. Some people I know, they say, how come you got socialist in your name? How come you're a socialist? You know why I'm a socialist? Because this very system that we know as capitalism was born off the slave trade. The first big business in this country ever had was selling niggers. Yes, that's why I'm a socialist, because I hate this filthy, rotten system that places value on things before they do on human beings. A system that was born off native land and black hands, off the twin pillars of the near extermination of the indigenous population and the free labor of black people. Reagan talking about taking food stamps. Reagan talking about taking welfare. What about all the welfare that built this country? Free labor, black labor. Don't talk to me about welfare. It's important for us to understand this. It was the labor of black people. It was a slave trade. There wasn't even a world economic system before the slave trade. People traded with each other, but there was no world economy. It was the slave trade that created the world economy. It was the slave trade that created the economy that in its developed stage we know today as capitalism or imperialism. That was the basis for its creation. So if you want to end it, it seems logical that what you've got to do is destroy the structures which were built off the slave trade. The key to that inside this country is the liberation of black people. We shouldn't have a problem understanding that we are Africans. If we do have a problem understanding it, we've just got a problem. The truth is, the truth will set you free, and it is true. We want to talk about the system because it needs to be understood what is happening. There's a crisis in the world today. This crisis, on the one hand, is causing a tremendous amount of suffering among the people. We're talking about, by government statistics, unemployment among the total black population of more than 17%. But that's an understatement. The government declares the only people who are unemployed are persons who, within a recent period of time, went to one of those government unemployment agencies. Most black people gave up on those a long time ago. According to most persons who use more reliable ways of figuring the unemployment of black people in this country, it is at least 40%. The Urban League makes it about 25%. And the Urban League is correct, even if that means that the unemployment for black people in this country is as bad as it was for the general population in this country during the Great Depression of the 1930s. And it's been that way since 1975. We're talking about 7 years of that kind of crisis. We're talking about a crisis that is happening in the world that is impacting on us in this country in a fashion that a minimum of 60% of our children between the ages of 16 and 20 are unemployed. And in some places, the figure is clearly as high as 90% of our youth without jobs. And you wonder why they're talking about some petty bourgeois televisions, some petty bourgeoisie's televisions. There's a crisis in this country that impacts us in a particular way. Nevertheless, even with this crisis, in our party we sum up this period of the world today as one being generally good, but dangerous. The reason we say that the world situation is generally good is because it is a world situation where all over the world, the struggles and the victories of the people against neocolonialism, colonialism, and economic dependency are setting the historical trend that you see every time you pick up your newspaper and read General Alexander Haig or Ronald Reagan making a new threat against somebody in the world. That's why you see them talking about a $250 billion budget for the military in the next fiscal year and a $1.5 trillion budget for the military over the next 5 years, because all over the world, people struggling against neocolonialism and against economic dependency are winning. What does that mean? It means those structures which are responsible for the creation and the maintenance of this vicious system are being destroyed all over the world. You have to think about the system that we live with. And it's a worldwide system. It's as a bloated octopus-like animal with the lust of a vampire, with his many arms reaching out around the world, sucking the blood of the poor peasants of El Salvador, sucking the blood of the emaciated black people of Azania. You call it South Africa. And now what we see all around the world are people cutting off those blood-sucking arms and causing economic and political crisis worse than ever before in the history of this system. In the past, after the Second Imperialist War, what this vicious system did when the masses rose up demanding freedom and independence was to fall back on a system called neocolonialism. It means a new colonialism. In the old period around the world, the vicious ruling class dogs themselves would send some people from their own countries to stand over the people with guns. But there is one thing about colonialism that the United States is beginning to understand more and more from the internal situation in this country. That's one thing about colonialism. The masses can always identify the enemy as a foreigner and an alien. That's why you always hear black people, when you ask them what's happening, they say, these crackers are always messing with us. It's like the 60s when rebellion took off in black cities all over the country. The white people moved out of their stores and put black people in the stores, made them look like they owned the stores. And then a black person would sit up in there with his soul brother sign on the window. The economies are still going through the same, the economics are still going through the same person. They fool you. You think your money is going to the black community when it's going to the same place it was going before. Well, that's what happens with this new economic system internationally. So that in Iran, they overthrow a man named Mossadegh and put in Uncle Tom, the Shah of Iran, in power. In Grenada, they put in Uncle Tom named Gary in power. In Cuba, they put in Uncle Tom named Batista in power. In Nicaragua, they put in Uncle Tom named Somoza in power. All over the world, we start seeing Uncle Toms going into power. It's just like in this country. In this country, we used to call them Oreos, black on the outside and white on the inside. We see these things all over the world. The Asian people call them pineapples, yellows on the outside and white on the inside. The Indians call them apples, red on the outside and white on the inside. The Mexican people call them coconuts, brown on the outside and white on the inside. All over the world, this kind of thing is happening, and that was the only way they rescued the system temporarily from the rage of the masses. And look around you today. How did Reagan get elected? I want to just stop here, just briefly. I know we're talking about martyrs and martyrdom, and I think it's really important. And we're going into this whole discussion about colonialism, neocolonialism, how the system came into being. But we're also talking about Ronald Wilson Reagan. And the reason it's important to talk about Reagan, because Reagan was the Trump of his era. Reagan was a B-rated movie actor. That's what Ronald Reagan was. And they dragged him out because he had a large fan base, and a fan base among certain sectors of the bourgeoisie who had been propping him up for a long time. And Reagan's role was to push back against the victories of the peoples around the world. That's why they had him. That's what he came there for. He was going to take back, he was complaining because James Earl Carter, the U.S. president, that many liberals like to think of as the last honest president, he came and replaced, he was refreshing to white power because he followed Nixon, who had been kicked out of office and was recognized as being problematic in a lot of different ways in terms of morality. But Reagan came because Carter, who was a reflexive kind of move from liberals in this country, and who came to office, saying, I will never tell you a lie, and that our policies, this government is going to be based on human rights, and he raised all that human rights stuff. And as he was doing this, of course, he brought Brzezinski into as national security advisor, and Brzezinski, Mikhail Brzezinski, is the guy who created the modern jihad. He is the guy who organized all of these Islamic forces and gave them weapons, trainings, and money to go into Afghanistan to overthrow the Afghan government that was supported by the Russians, by the Soviet Union, in order to give the Soviets their own economic depleting kind of Vietnam, such as what the United States had experienced. But Reagan, he claimed Carter gave away our canal. That was, quote unquote, our canal, because the Panamanians were going to acquire the Panama Canal. They had this ditch that had been dug, not by our, but by black people. Africans dug the Panama Canal. Black people did. Died like flies. And from the, what do they call it, tsetse fly, there. I mean, people were dying. I mean, literally died. And many African people, Comrade Gaida, her parents, her grandparents, ended up in what they now call Panama because they were brought there by Europeans, by white power, to dig that hole. And they needed the Panama Canal because they needed to be able to ship goods without having to go around South America. And so they created a Panamanian liberation movement. The white people did, the imperialists did. They created a Panamanian liberation movement because what they called Panama used to be part of Colombia. And through this, they were victorious. And then Panama becomes independent, quote unquote. Then it gives them permission to dig the canal, right? So they give themselves permission, really. They give themselves permission to dig the canal. And black people dug that. So, but Reagan, well, he was a Neanderthalic person, politician, represented a Neanderthalic manifestation of imperialism that was upset because Carter gave away our canal. And he was upset because of the Nicaraguan and Salvadorian revolutions, and he was going to push all of that back. And he was upset because the Iranians had captured these so-called diplomats, and the Iranians correctly identified as a nest of spies in Tehran who were supporting a neocolonial government that had been put in power by the United States government, right? And so Reagan was going to push back on all of that, and he raised up all of the patriotic fervor of the white nationalists in this country in a way that Trump succeeded in doing as well. And And I'm mentioning this because I was just looking at something even today of some demonstration just happened recently, and people are running around talking about fascism and Trump being fascist, and what's the woman's name who from the Pelosi being fascist, and everybody's a damn fascist. And when you see them shooting people in the street, that's fascism. When you see them locking, that's fascism. Well, it's always been colonialism. Colonialism has acted the same way, and you're making a big mistake when you're identifying as fascism. Not because there's not a crisis. There is a crisis in imperialism, but colonialism acts the same way all the time. And we've seen you trapped fighting against fascism. I mean, the French were some of the biggest anti-fascist fighters, at least in theory. And they were part of an anti-fascist movement. The United States fought against fascism. They're talking about the big guys now, the real so-called big guy fascists, the Hitlers and stuff like that. They fought. And even after the French participated even in trying to hold the Vietnamese dominate colonial domination, the French were holding the Vietnamese under colonial domination, and there's nothing the Germans did to anybody that was worse than what the French were doing in Vietnam and all over Africa. This was the Democrats. These were the democracies fighting against fascism. And this is a term that constantly gets used, and it confuses African people because it obscures the reality that Africans live under colonialism. And the fight against fascism is something that happens because when the capitalist system articulates itself, when it reveals the dictatorship of the capital of the bourgeoisie is exposed to white people, they call it capitalism. But the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie is always evident to the colonized people, to the French, to the Africans, to every community that we are aware of. That's colonialism. But the Europeans, the white people, will have you fight against fascism, because the fight against fascism is to fight against the crisis as they experience it as white people, and you can fight against fascism and your ass will still be colonized. If you fight against colonialism, you will destroy fascism, because you will destroy every manifestation of capitalism, because it requires to be able to live off the blood of the colonized people for its existence. That's the only reason I'm mentioning that. I think you have to really understand that. It's really important. So anyway, and look around you today. I'm back on page 268, and I gotta expedite this. How did Reagan get elected? He got elected because in this campaign he was saying Carter let our friends, the Shah, get overthrown in Iran. Ain't that what he said? He let down our friend Somoza in Nicaragua. That's what he said. And before Nicaragua and Grenada, the first black working class socialist revolution in the Americas overthrew Gary. So what we are seeing in the world today is neocolonialism. This Uncle Tomism, this punkishism is being overthrown. There isn't anything standing between the masses of the people and the imperialist ruling class now that these Uncle Toms are being thrown out of power. This system is standing on its last leg. Kwame Nkrumah said it. He said neocolonialism is the last stage of imperialism, the last stage of imperialism. You don't believe it? Watch what's happening, what happens in Seattle when you get rid of old shuffling Sam Smith. When the ruling class hasn't got anybody to stand between him and the masses, you know that the masses will get their asses. So we got this whole system that's built off blood sucking. Staying fat because it sucks blood, finally being under assault. We got a ruling class that, should it dare to look across the horizon, can see its own death in the future. And it's terrified. That's what's causing the economic crisis. Not only here, look throughout the capitalist world and you see the same crisis happening. Now, I know somebody got some other explanation, but you know about this crisis. But explanation for you about this crisis, they call themselves socialists too, but you know how that works. Malcolm X used to tell you that it's always interesting that when they are putting a rope around your neck, you calling to Jesus, and they are calling to Jesus. It's really interesting that you both are calling, or one would think that you were talking about the same thing, but we know we're not talking about the same thing. Talking about socialism now. There are socialists who would tell you that there are other reasons for the crisis in this country and in the imperialist world. These are white socialists and even some black socialists who have been taught by white socialists. I learned some things from a white socialist. I don't have no problem with that. It's just like when I hop in a Ford car, it don't make no difference to me who made the car if I can hop in the car and serve the people in that car. That's cool. Ford used the car for different reasons than I used the car. Ford was a fascist. Ford supported Hitler, you know. Ford uses, and I'm saying this because somebody was saying, well, you're saying communism and socialism, that's a white man's thing, you understand? Because they said, come on, please. And Ford uses the car to rip you off. I use the car to organize black people all over the country so we can get back what rightfully belongs to us. But there's a particular white man whose name is Karl Marx. It is interesting that one day he is reputed to have said, all I know is that I am not a Marxist. Apparently he had to say that because of some of the things, interesting kinds of ideas that you hear coming from many white Marxists today. We call them dogmatists. We call them ideological imperialists. We call them Ku Klux communists. But the other thing that he taught for those who would listen and for those who would not have a stake in the lies, the revolution is inherently honest. A revolutionary is inherently honest because it is only the truth that will free us. A revolutionary is inherently honest because it is only the truth that will free us. If we don't know the truth, then we will die. If we can't find our way out of this mess, we will die. So we must find the truth. It doesn't mean you become the best debater or BSer in the world. That's not the truth. Being able to dismiss the truth or hide the truth or to win an argument because you can deflect the truth. That's not truth. That will not set you free. That will not make you free. We have to know the truth in order to be able to win our freedom. Karl Marx said that if you want to seek the truth, if you want to find the truth, then you have to examine the phenomena itself. If you want to understand the conditions of black people, don't tell me you understand the conditions of black people because you examine Karl Marx. That's ridiculous. Anybody who uses the science that Karl Marx advocated will tell you that the starting point for the investigation of political theory and the political economy is one's own oppression. So if I want to know why a cat purrs like it does, I don't go examining monkeys. Someone's going to explain to me the condition of black people in this country in 1982 based on what happened in Europe in 1847. I say they're mad, they're insane, they are ill. They must get out of the way, they must get out of the way. We want to talk about the African martyr because we want to talk about our history. If we're going to talk about liberation, then it is necessary for us to sum up our history. We are talking about black people in this country not even understanding and believing and needing to know that we are an African people. The system separates us and alienates us from our own culture. I know black people who the only thing they know about Africa is what they see on television, like Tarzan. I talk to black people from the continent of Africa. They say they thought that was us. They know damn well that wasn't in Africa. They separate us from our own culture, from our own history, so we are ashamed to be who we are. Why should we be ashamed of being Africans? We brought the world civilization. Are you crazy? It was from Africa that the world got philosophy, science, mathematics. It is also important to understand who built the pyramids of Egypt. It also understand who we are and where we came from because black people built the pyramids of Egypt. Black people who built the pyramids of Egypt ought to be damn sure to refuse to live in the slums of Seattle. I know that's a struggle. I know what you're going to say. I was born here, and Africa was a long time ago. That's what the white people tell you. That's what you say. That's why you say it. My great-grandfather was born here. I was born in this country. Malcolm had the best answer in the world for that. He said chickens are sometimes born in ovens, but that don't make them biscuits. And there's another saying from the continent itself. It goes, You can go to the forest and you can cut down a tree. You can strip the branches from the tree and drag the tree to the river. You can put the tree in the river and leave it there for 1,000,000 years, but it will never, never, never turn into a crocodile. That's science. You don't believe it, do you? I'm sure you believe it. You know who we are. We have to stop jiving. What's happened to us is that along with the creation of this economic system, which in its developed form we call imperialism, there was an ideological justification for it. They justified what they did by making us less than human, by painting a picture of us as being less than human, by taking the most humane people on the face of the earth and painting an anti-human picture of us. They even have a saying in England that, and it is within this country as well, that white people had to go over there to civilize black people. They call it taking up the white man's burden. Can you believe it? That's what they say, but you know better. It's important for us to understand who we are. All of us have to work at deepening the national consciousness of our whole people. Watch right now. It's very, very, very important. In the 1960s, you and I watched this country drop bombs on the black babies in the Congo. Yes, we did. And we didn't say anything about it, didn't even raise a hand because they were bombing Africans and we were Negroes. Just a few weeks ago, you and I sat in our living rooms and watched them beat the hell out of African people in Miami and said it was all right because they were beating Haitians and we were Negroes. Now, if the white people hadn't told you that they were Haitians and if the sound had been turned off the television, you would have seen them beating those black people in color. You'd have been so fired up, you should have been ready to do something. You would have been ready to do something just like you did in Miami with Arthur McDuffie. You were fired up just like you did when you saw the kids in Atlanta wearing your little green ribbons everywhere. But they can kill black people and beat the hell out of them, and they can call them Haitians, and you don't make a move because they fool you. They have you calling yourself Negro Americans. You watch, but you don't make a move. They call us Haitians over here, Grenadians over there, Kenyans over there. Ain't that something? They got us tricked. We can't even unite with each other to kick the hell out of the single enemy we've got. Ain't that something? They've got us fighting in Seattle for a few jobs when the whole world belongs to us. They've got us fighting in Seattle for a job, or when the continent of Africa and everything on it belongs to us. They've got us fighting for a job over our own freedom and liberation. Isn't that something? It's a trick bag. We've got to deepen the national consciousness of our people all over. We've got to help the people understand who we are to unite with ourselves. I was talking to two young brother Ward's brother today, said, we've got to talk about Martyrs Day. I said, your brother is a martyr. He said, don't talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. We've got to think about it. We've got to talk about it because the blood that has spilled, that we have spilled more than any other human beings on the face of the earth. All this blood has taught us more than anybody else about the viciousness of this creature. This creature is vicious. This system is vicious. It cannot tell the truth. It cannot move honestly. It cannot do justice. Our children need to know this. They need to know every inch of betrayal, every year of betrayal. They need to know how they got here. We can't tell them, go to school and learn about George Washington, our forefather. That's important. So what we see in the world today is essentially what we define the world as, is what we define the world as generally good because of the victories we can see. Let's list them if you want. Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Iran, Cuba, Vietnam, Nicaragua. Everywhere you look, the people are fighting and winning, and this system is in terror because it can't survive. It cannot survive without the ability to suck the blood of the people, and they're going to draft your children too to go and fight, and you're going to let them go. You're going to let them go. You're going to sit right there and say, well, if they don't go, if we don't let them go, they're going to put us in jail. You're going to say that's the law. That's what Negroes said during slavery. Slavery was the law. Every time a black person broke away from slavery, he was breaking the law. You better not let them take a single black child. You let them kill 1,000 in Jonestown. They killed how many in Atlanta? And now they're going to take them and kill them
from Seattle and all the other cities fighting against other oppressed peoples. No, it's the system that's in crisis. It's a desperate system. That's what makes it dangerous, because it's a desperate system. But my sisters, and that's why people talk about fascism and look how bad Trump and all that. Yeah, it is in crisis. But what's put it in crisis is not something that white people did. It's what the oppressed people are doing all around the world, has taken away their capacity to live like they've lived all along. It's the fact that people are fighting back, that's digging the grave of imperialism. And here the imperialists are watching all these grave diggers around the world, shovels in hand, digging the future for them in the hell that has been reserved for everybody who stood on the side of imperialism. That's the crisis. That's the crisis. That's the crisis that they're experiencing. And that's something that we need to understand. So, but my brothers and sisters, we can do all the talking and getting sweaty that we want to do, and the system will still be here. I had an uncle in a little place like St. Petersburg, Florida, a little place you never heard of him, but he was a legend in his own time. He was like black people that are or have been in virtually every city in this country, people that white people don't mess with. That's why they call him a crazy nigger. You've heard of them before, haven't you? He was what they call a crazy nigger. They called him that because they always had to have an excuse for not messing with him. And he used to say, always say, that a conversation is the cheapest commodity on the block. Everybody's got one. Tonight you're hearing mine. It's nothing but a discussion, to the extent that's all we do. Talk and applaud and get sweaty and go home and feel good because we've heard some discussion. But revolution, that's what it's gonna take. I hope nobody's got a problem with that. That's what it's gonna take. Revolution is a science, it's a process, which among other things demands a tremendous amount of organization, demands some studying among ourselves, demands some will, demands some tactics and some strategies, demand the ability to actually do something. That's what a revolution demands, and that's what it's going to take to free us. In order to understand a little bit more of that, and still within the context of this discussion about the martyrs, we need to understand this period that we live in as black people in this country. Oftentimes we forget, and there is a way that we are self-critical, which is self-defeating. In the early 60s and throughout the 60s, black people in this country defeated this country ideologically and politically. As a result of those struggles, the basic ideas which prevailed in our community were no longer the ideas of the oppressor, but the ideas of black people looking for freedom. Do you remember that period? Somebody in here looks old enough to remember that period. All over this country, we see everything that's black, schools and other institutions popping up. We've got a free clinic here, and that was born during the same period. I don't know what it's about in 1982, but I know what it was about during that period. It's impossible to pick up a newspaper and not see some black people setting the torch to city. It was impossible to pick up a newspaper and not see some black people setting the torch to city after city all over this country. Do you remember that? I remember when they murdered Martin Luther King, they had to put tanks around the White House, not because of some so-called Soviet threat, but because of the fear that black people would take that sucker off. We had defeated this country ideologically and politically. But spontaneous movement, it was spontaneous movement. It was a movement that was not moving in accordance to its own laid out tactics and strategy for liberation. It was black people getting off, if you will, and consequently we had no understanding of what a great power such as this country would do in the face of being defeated ideologically and politically by the most critical sector of this population. And what it did in the face of that defeat is one of the things that made it responsible for us having so many martyrs during the 60s. It launched a military offensive against the black community all over the country. Black people dying like flies in the streets. Larry Ward was one here in Seattle. Oakland, San Francisco, Birmingham, Alabama, Tampa and St. Petersburg, Florida, Brooklyn, New York. Everywhere you looked, this reactionary ruling class white power force came down in the black community in the military way. Those that didn't get killed and locked up were chased into exiles. We got black people from the Black Panther Party in Paris, France right now. From the 60s, you got people like Sundiata Acoli, Black Panther Party member and one of the Panther 21, locked up in Marion, Illinois right now. You got Geronimo Pratt, Black Panther Party member, locked up in San Quentin right now. You got Assata Shakur, only free because black people went in there and moved her out of prison. It was a military offensive against our community, against our movement, which smashed it and crushed it. But even a military offensive would not have been good enough. It's not strong enough to kill the idea. You've got to also kill the ideas that push the revolution forward. And so after we saw the military offensive by the government, we saw the ideological offensive by the white left. Suckers called the October League, now called the Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist. Suckers called the Revolutionary Union, now called the Revolutionary Communist Party. These suckers were nowhere to be found when they killed Mark Clark and Fred Hampton, when they were shooting Carl Hampton down in Houston, Texas. When they were shooting Assata in the freeway in New Jersey, you'd never find those suckers. When black people had our asses up against the wall, where were they? In the libraries. And after the defeat, after the military defeat of our movement, these slimy creatures came crawling out of their garbage cans, making an offensive against, not on the ruling class, not on imperialism, but on the so-called national question, on the black movement. They split the remaining black organizations all over the country. They smashed them. They united with their ruling class, and they are partially responsible for the fact that we've had 10 long years of non-activity in our communities, because after the police and the military broke the backs of our organizations, these slimy creatures destroyed the ideas that fuel the people to make them fight from generation to generation. We must possess control of our own movement. We're talking about instruments which will liberate us. We do not put that instrument in the hands of anybody else. In order to take it on, though, it means we must act responsibly. It means we must get rid of a lot of trash that we bring into our own movement. It means that it's not good enough to say we're going to win because we're bad. Hell, we aren't any badder than we were when Nat Turner walked the earth. Malcolm X was the baddest black man in this country. We still haven't won. It's going to take more than being black and being bad to win. It's going to take organization. It's going to take a clear theory. It's going to take an understanding who we are, where it is we are heading for. It's going to take an understanding that this foul system, this system must die. This system must be destroyed. If you got a system that can only live through killing others, it's a common sense that the system's got to go. Now, you can be bashful about that if you want to. I'm not suggesting that everyone should go home and get Saturday night specials and go and try to fight the system. It's going to take a lot of hard work. That's why we are working. So anyway, this is part of what we're talking about when we look at the issue of martyrdom. And I think it's really important that we've discussed much of what I've just read, because we're not just talking about people dying to die. There's another section that we're not going to read. It's called Live Like Our African Martyrs. But there's this whole social system that we are fighting against that's responsible for creating martyrs. It churns out martyrs on a regular basis, but martyrs need to become something that it turns out dead black people. We have to give them martyrdom. And this martyrs is what's going to fuel the revolutionary struggle of the future. So I want to go ahead and stop now. I've read a long time, and at least we have some time for discussions, and I want to open it up. So, Uhuru.
Uhuru, well, I just want everybody to give a round of applause for Chairman Omali Yeshitela for that amazing study. That was so good. I almost forgot to get up because I was phone in my face trying to read the study with the chairman. So we have a lot of, comments so far, but we really want you guys to ask questions. This is the discussion portion of the study, so go ahead and leave your comments, questions for the chairman in regards to what it was we just discussed today, which was a lot, talking about African Martyrs Day and Malcolm X, but also a lot of other things and especially like deepening the national consciousness and things like of that nature. I wanted to recognize some people who were on the live stream. We have Pat from London. And we have, and I'm self-critical if I pronounce this wrong, Neocolonial, whose says, the revolutionary greetings from Venezuela. The revolution will never be televised. Hands off Venezuela. Uhuru. We have Kitty Riley, member of the African People Solidarity Committee, says, profound, take away fear, this arsenal of oppression from the ruling class. We have Comrade Omali Yeshitela, who commented, also, as Carter was talking about human rights, the APSP was leading demonstrations in his hometown of Plains, Georgia, demanding the freedom for Desi Woods and an end to colonial violence. We have Trent A. Garrett, not sure where he's from, but he's just saluting the chairman and for deepening the national consciousness of our whole people. We have Comrade Vince Lawrence, one of the founding members of the African People's Socialist Party and member of the African People's Socialist Party today. And he says, the revolutionary uses what we can and we leave the rest. And we have Raya Fogarty, member of the African People's Solidarity Committee, says, I remember as a teen in small town Missouri, white people with bumper stickers and everything that said F Iran to unify white people / motivated by being able to be happy parasites. Then we have Timba says it's going to take organization and African internationalism in response to what it takes to overturn this system. And I'm just trying to, find more comments as they come in. We have, thank you, David. Nanaya Grant, the Northern Regional Representative for the African People's Socialist Party, says, wow, this study was amazing. Thank you, Chairman. And looking for more. We have Crown, who says, the system's got to go. Oh, Trent is from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Uhuru. And, yeah, I don't, is there anything in the room? I don't see any other questions, or there's just a bunch of comments like saluting you, Chairman, and appreciating the study. So,
yeah, well, I think that one of the things that I'm really interested in also is, I think people who are involved in this discussion, in this study, recognize, generally speaking, that the system has to go. But the whole issue of Martyrs' Day and celebrating Martyrs' Day, I think that's one of the things that we want to talk about too, and it perhaps got lost a bit in the discussion. The significance of recognizing, first of all, that imperialism kills us and it will continue to kill us. But the threat of death cannot be something that can prevent us. It should not be something to prevent us. I was in Kenya, in Nairobi, and Dedan Kimathi, who was the leader of the Kenyan Land Freedom Army, Field Marshal, Kenyan Land Freedom Army, they call Mau Mau. There's a statue there that the neocolonial puppets have allowed to be there, because you can't liquidate Kimathi's role. But it says something about better to die on our feet than live on our knees, and quoting from Kimathi. And I just think that that a people who that is oppressed must have the ability to fight through our fears for our liberation. Otherwise, we will never be free. And martyrdom is a tool that's been used by oppressed people everywhere to have us to be able to march through the fear of death to our liberation. Uhuru. So I don't know how people responded or experienced that aspect of the discussion. Uhuru.
Uhuru. I also want to recognize Ms. Minnie is watching, currently says Uhuru Chairman. And Comrade Deputy Chair Omali Yeshitela asked this question, or it says, one, Uhuru Chairman, thank you for this important study. Could you speak to the question of this thing called ADOS, which is is it African descendants of slaves or American descendants of slaves? It's like a new identity now, almost as it can kind of almost be like correlated with that whole Black Belt South thing. But it's like the idea that we have to, African people in this country have to separate themselves.
There is, it's really interesting because it's a relatively disturbing phenomenon. The African petty bourgeoisie sectors of it will find every reason not to be connected to Africa. That's why they even have to have this hyphenated, or if they are connected, some kind of distant connection, a relationship to, but not part of. And that's why, even Jesse Jackson was a big force that created this whole concept of African Americans. And that's how we're going to be known as African Americans and what have you. But the thing is that I was in Ghana. It's really an interesting thing because in Ghana, there are a lot of Africans who've lived in Ghana now for 20, 30, 40 years, 50 years or so. And many of them consider themselves a part of the American tribe or the African American tribe.
To distinguish themselves from other African people in Ghana, they are the African American tribe. And this is just nonsense. It's a way that some Africans cannot cut themselves free from this American blood-sucking umbilical cord. And rather than, so they would call ourselves descendants of what, slaves? We're not descendants of slaves, we're descendants of free people. That's what we are. And we were free people captured and enslaved. And to make us descendants of slaves gives us the history that begins in some plantation in Mississippi, Alabama. That ain't true. We brought civilization to the planet Earth. Our history is much older than that. Our history of Africa, the history of this thing that we've gone through with America is like the blink of an eye in the total history of Africa and African people. So we reject that, and we reject it also for political reasons in the sense that it's another effort by a sector of the African population that just cannot see itself being separated entirely, breaking the bonds from the U.S. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Sister Kenya is on and wanted you, Chairman, to speak about the assassination attempt on you that actually happened.
Which one? I think Kenya might have been in San Francisco when someone fired a high-powered rifle at the event that we were holding there. That would have been, what would that have been? That would have been perhaps maybe 1980, 81, 82 or something like that. But yeah, I mean, those efforts have been made. I mean, I've been jailed, I've been handcuffed in the backs of a police car, beaten and what have you. And so they can't beat it out you, they can't jail it out you, and then of course, if they're trying to, to make you no longer significant as a person, they will kill you. And so they've made all of that stuff they've done, to me. And if the fear of death can be victorious, then we will never, ever be able to fight for our freedom. I mean, my mother was terrified, all the time. She was terrified because she knew, and our people know what imperialist white power would do. The problem we have now is that we have the ability to talk about black history as sort of like something that happened. Look how much progress we've made kind of way, wow, and that was black history, and talk about King and talk about Malcolm as though history stopped, as though the struggle that they were both involved in and that we are involved in, and the people has been dealt with. That's why the thing that we did in Oxford, the debate in Oxford, was so important, because it takes us, because the thing is that at one point it was clear to us, the people, we were fighting for quote unquote civil rights, that's what it seems to be. And I have to say, we can go back further than that, because at one point we were fighting Africa for Africans, at home and abroad. Then the defeat of that movement, which was a movement on the offensive, even living under the worst kind of colonial domination in the world, Garvey led this magnificent organization. A lot of people don't like Garvey, especially the Negro intellectuals, petty bourgeois intellectuals who sometimes call themselves Marxist, communists, and any other kind of left this or left that, don't like Garvey. You understand? But Garvey was not just an individual. Garvey led a movement of up to 11 million Africans and people around the world. And from people who were located in Australia, people who were located not only in Africa and throughout this country. In Cuba, I think, might have been the largest group of African Garvey branches in the world, might have been located right there in Cuba. When we look at what happened in the Cuban Revolution, it didn't start with Fidel and Che, it started with Garvey, you understand? Or certainly Garvey was the highest politicized pronouncement of that. Didn't even start with Garvey, because the resistance by Africans in Cuba, just like every place else, going on for a long time. But Garvey pulled it all together and gave it some kind of direction. So Garvey was this really, like powerful, potent
force and trying to take us to the future. And then it was the defeat of the Garvey movement, then our movement was on the defensive at this point, and so it was now civil rights trying to make it inside the system. Garvey said, you know, we have our own, we want our own free Africa, we want our own resources, we have our own government. He said, that's what I set out to do. I looked for my government, couldn't find one, I set out to help to create it. Now the civil rights movement is a defensive movement, where a sector of the African petty bourgeoisie, connected more or less to liberal imperialism, now finds a way to survive and make it better inside the system. It was a different place that we were located in. But a point that I wanted to make is that some point. Yeah.
For real, I really want to appreciate that, Chairman. And I'm finishing up this book, Fire from the Mountain, that talks about the Sandinista revolution. And there was a part in it where one of the guy that trained a lot of the people in the mountain, a lot of the guerrilla fighters, when he was killed, and he was looked up to as like just a really top guy. And so there was like a really defeatist attitude when he was killed, that, okay, well, now everybody who he had trained, everybody was like, well, if the top guy, if this guy can go, then what does that make us? But the guy before he was killed had said, I feel confident now because I have trained all of you, so the guard can take me out, but I know that I have taught you all so that the revolution will basically continue. And the man Omar Cabezas reflected on that statement, and it just reminds me of African internationalism and how the revolution can never be defeated because we have planted the seed for it, and now it exists all around the world. And so it's here in the US, it's in the Caribbean, it's in Africa, it's in Europe, and it's everywhere now. So there's no ability for the US to do what it did in the 60s, and which was even at that point too late, because we were able to pick back off, you were able to pick back off from where all of the Africans were assassinated or imprisoned, and brought African internationalism to the world, and has created a situation where revolution can never be defeated ever again. So long as there's one African internationalist on the planet Earth, the revolution lives, and it will be won. So I just wanted to say that. We have Stephen Duane. Does it say where he's from? Oh, okay. Steve Duane says, what are we doing to pull all of our organizations together under the party? I'm not sure what organization this person is part of. We must nationalize our efforts together without exclusion.
We have to internationalize our movement, but there will be exclusions. But there's no. The fact of the matter is that the party is a revolutionary advanced attachment of the African working class. It's not just a black organization. It represents a particular social force, the social force that we have identified as critical for the defeat of imperialism and the liberation of Africa and African people worldwide, that will not just destroy white power over our lives, but will not be able to reproduce the same social system of exploitation. The thing is that we don't want to just win, but we have to overturn the kind of system that we're living in, and all of the Africans won't do that. Some Africans have become a part of another social force that sees its future as being having the same kind of system that will benefit off the labor, the sweat and blood of the African workers and poor peasants. So that's why we created also, opened so many doors for different Africans who might come from other sectors of the African population in terms of their class position, but they can join the revolution under the leadership of the African working class. And that's what we have created with the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, African National Women's Organization, African National Prison Organization, various other organizations that people can join and participate in without themselves having to be revolutionaries, but as a consequence of being in that organization, are part of a revolutionary process and revolutionary project. So we're open to everybody who wants to make this revolution. And I believe that obviously, and it's not just good enough to talk about inside the United States. I mean, that's why we're going through the same process in what they call South Africa right now, having the same discussions about Who is a part of this revolutionary movement? Who's going to make this revolution? We've seen what happened in South Africa under the leadership of the vile, servile, lick-spittled, butt-kissing African petty bourgeoisie in the form of the African National Congress. At one time led by the noble Negro Nelson Mandela, who was held to such great esteem by, by white people all the world, wasn't mad with nobody. He wasn't angry with anybody. Actually went so far as to get out of prison and then have the prison house that he was in prison reconstructed, that he lives in a house like that. Even hired the guy who was his guard in prison. I mean, and he's the Nelson Mandela. These are the Negroes who are not angry with anybody. We mad as hell. We mad as hell. We want to tear it up by the roots and build a whole new social system.
We have Comrade Kundai, who is located in Huntsville, Alabama, says, long live Chairman Omali for continuing the work. We have, just going past this. Comrade Valerie from the Huru Solidarity Movement says, deep appreciation for this incredible political education. Shupavu, who is the Midwest regional representative for the party, says, I love how the chairman replied that we need to internationalize our movement, but there will be exclusions, and says that we really appreciate this study. Comrade Malika Alexander, who is located in Illinois, she says, Uhuru, as an African woman, this study deepens the understanding of how liberalism must be addressed. Every step that we make has to be done without fear of retaliation, scrutiny, or death. Uhuru, Comrade Malika. And Trent said where he was from. Where did he say? I'm sorry, Trent, I forgot already. But he says, we are Africans in America. The chairman is correct. We're mad as hell. So I don't see, there's all, I mean, you've already went into it, Chairman. You talked about, there was somebody earlier on here, you know, talking about we have to reject socialism and we can't do that. No socialism. No to socialism, that's what they were saying. And but you went into that.
He said no to socialism?
Yeah, he said no to socialism.
Did he say why?
He said it stops economic development for Africans.
Yes,
It stops economic development for Africans?
Yes.
Dummy. It is capitalism that destroyed economic development for Africans. Everywhere Africans live, there's only one dominant social system in the whole world today. The dominant social system in the whole world today is the capitalist social system. It is the social system that for the last 600 years has defined the reality for every person on the planet Earth. It is the fundamental configuration, political and economic configuration of the world has been based on the accomplishment of capitalism. That's the most reactionary, stupid, racist, if you will, colonialist statement that you can make, that socialism prevents the somehow economic development of black people or African people. Dummy, are you saying the capitalists created the white power? Capitalism was born as white power. White power was born as capitalism. And so you have a minority of the world's population that's responsible for 80% of the human beings on the planet Earth trying to survive off less than $10 US a day. Is that 80% of the world's population suffering because of the absence of socialism or the presence of capitalism? Is it capitalism or socialism that caused that? You dummy. I don't have no respect for that kind of stupidity. You know, it's all right if you came into a neutral discussion and had that, but in a discussion of the African People's Socialist Party where we're given the whole background and basis for that, and to come up with some, no. Go, read something. Read Uneasy Equilibrium. Read. You need a much better understanding of that, comrade. I don't like that whole personalized thing that I just did, but it's really insulting. In 21st century, to have to defend the people from capitalism when it demonstrates its venom, its viciousness every day of our lives. We see what it's doing to human beings everywhere, preventing any kind of economic development for the masses of people around the world, and you would come up with something like that. I don't think I want to apologize for that, what I said. Uhuru, go ahead.
Uhuru, Chairman. Well, we just really want to salute Chairman again for that amazing study. Thank you, Chairman. And that brings us to our announcements, comrades, brothers, and sisters. So if you had a comment that did not get addressed, be sure that we have staff in the comment section that will make sure that your comment is seen and, raised to the chairman to be responded to. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Winning the War of Ideas. For your worldwide revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com. For Revolutionary Radio, dynamic shows and music by Africans all around the world, tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. We are in our last week of the February Member Fund Drive, and we're calling on all of you to help us reach our $7,000 goal. We're over 60% of our way, and we need you to help us bring it home. You can go to blackpower96.org/donate, call 1-888-979-BP96, that's 1-888-979-2796, or tell us how much you can contribute today in the Facebook/YouTube chat. Did you unite with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspahuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. You can also see it in the link in the YouTube and Facebook comment chat, apspahuru.org, if you are interested in joining the African People's Socialist Party. Join the Freedom Mass Choir and Band. The Freedom Mass Choir and Band is an all-African community group of singers and instrumentalists that sing songs of resistance and revolution. Members are located throughout the United States and attend weekly rehearsals both in person and via live stream and video. You can sign up by emailing blackpowerchoir@gmail.com or call 727-537-6736. A few announcements from Uhuru Foods and Pies. Uhuru Foods and Pies are selling delicious pies at the prestigious Mills College in Oakland. They have been the concessionaire for Ubuntu Theater for 4 consecutive weekends and will be there until March 3rd. They want you to know that every Saturday at the Grand Lake Farmers Market in Oakland, California, Uhuru Foods and Pies sells African comfort food to a broad base of hungry supporters. Happening today, Oakland will host its second Black Joy Parade with over 15,000 people anticipated. Uhuru Foods and Pies will be in the mix, selling their healthy and delicious foods and drinks, and of course, their pies. They are looking for volunteers who seek purpose in their service. Look them up and follow them on their Facebook page at Uhuru Foods and Pies. It's going down in St. Louis. Black Power Poetry will be live, so come see the real creative genius of the African working class. The Black Power Blueprint is hosting an open mic in the house that Black built. So save the date, March 22nd at 7 p.m. in the St. Louis Aquaba Hall, located on 4101 West Florissant Avenue, Black Power Poetry and Open Mic. For more information on this event or to sign up as an artist, email stlouis@apdf.org or call 314-380-0980. To learn more about the amazing project that is the Black Power Blueprint, visit blackpowerblueprint.org. On March 23rd to 24th, join the African National Women's Organization for their national plenary being held in St. Louis, Missouri. African women's role in the revolution is on the front lines, and ANWO helps us to understand this by showing its tremendous leadership of African women. Visit anwouhuru.org to learn more about this event. April 6th and 7th, the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations will be conducting its 3rd electoral campaign school in St. Petersburg, Florida. Do you want to learn how to run for office on a revolutionary platform such as the National Black Political Agenda for Self-Determination and win? You don't want to miss this school. With speakers from the BIB Steering Committee, including Chairman Omali Yeshitela himself, you can learn from the best. Visit blackisbackcoalition.org for more information on the electoral campaign school. The movement for white solidarity with Black power is growing. Witness it at the Uhuru Solidarity National Convention, April 13th and 14th in St. Louis, Missouri. Come see the growth of white reparations to African people and learn the role that white people can play in creating a future free of oppression. Visit uhurusolidarity.org to learn more about this convention. Pre-order your copy of Chairman Omali Yeshitela's latest book, Vanguard, The Advanced Attachment of the African Revolution, at burningspearmarketplace.com. This is your last week for a pre-order to receive the book with exclusive features such as the color photo spread and an autograph from the chairman. It's your last week of February. You have to pre-order in February in order to get these exclusive features. This book is the political report to the 7th Congress and features a foreword from ASI Secretary General Louise Kinshasa, as well as international solidarity statements from anti-colonial, anti-imperialist organizations existing around the world. Sign up for the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise. The Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise is the annual fundraiser held to support the work of the African Socialist International. The African Socialist International is an organization made up of African people located virtually on every continent, dedicated to overturning the conditions faced by African people worldwide. This year's cruise will be taking place from December 14th to 19th and will be sailing on the Carnival Sunrise from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, staying overnight in Havana, Cuba, and visiting Nassau, Bahamas. Join us for a 5-day trip filled with on- and off-board activities such as live games and contests, nightclubs, spas, swimming pools, fitness centers and casinos, excursions, and political education. Registration is now open and deposits can be made by calling the travel agent, Linda Stern, at 732-972-4171. If you want to further support the ASI and the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise, make a donation by visiting uhurulegacycruise.org. If you're local to St. Peter, St. Louis, at the Uhuru House, 3 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central, the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement will be hosting our Black Power Sunday rallies, raising important concerns and community issues and organizing to overturn them. That's 1245 Tyron Lewis in St. Pete and 4101 West Florissant in St. Louis. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of Omali Taught Me Sunday Study, and catch us back in an hour. Yes? Yeah, I was about to make that announcement. And catch us back in an hour on our newly launched YouTube page, Uhuru Congo, at 11 a.m. Eastern, to hear reports on the situation in Congo right now, featuring the chairman and ASI Secretary General Loezi Kinshasa. Thank you all so much. Uhuru. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. I got a little message. Oh, yes, all right, very important announcement as well. This is coming from the Office of the Chair. The Vanguard International Speaking Tour is making its first stop at the 2019 annual plenary in St. Louis on March 23rd to 24th. If you want to hear Chairman Omali Yeshitela live, and you want to book Chairman Omali Yeshitela, you can book him as part of the Vanguard Speaking Tour. Go to or you can email us at info@omaliyeshitela.org or call 727-914-3621. Very, very important. All right. Thank you, comrades, and we'll catch you all at 11 a.m. for Uhuru Congo. Uhuru.